So in our section 3 practice, we're going to go over some more examples over interval notation. So just kind of review how you know whether or not to use brackets or parentheses. So if you have an inequality that has greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, we're always going to use brackets with that number. When we have strictly greater than, strictly less than, and infinity or negative infinity, we always use parentheses. When we're looking at number lines, if you have an open circle at that value on a number line, that means you have a greater than or less than inequality, which would mean parentheses. And if you have a closed circle on that value on a number line, that indicates greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, which would mean a bracket used for that number. So the first set of examples we're going to look at is writing the interval notation from an inequality. So the first example we have is x greater than 8. So if I look back at my example, I have a strictly greater than, which means I'm going to know to use parentheses. Now when we're writing intervals, there is a specific way you have to do it. You have to put the smaller number on the left side of the interval and the larger number on the right. So when I look at the inequality x greater than 8, the smallest number I could potentially have is 8 because I want to talk about everything greater than that. Since there is no end to the numbers greater than 8, the right side of my inequality would be infinity. So I know anytime I have an infinity, parenthesis. So right off the bat, I should always be writing a parenthesis with an infinity. Because I have greater than 8, that tells me I'm also going to use a parenthesis with my 8. Our second example is x less than or equal to -3. So in thinking of terms of what's the smallest number I can have, well, there is no smallest number, very similar to how there is no biggest number. So in this case, I know my interval is going to start with negative infinity, and because I have a negative infinity, I have to have a parenthesis. And then I'm going to put comma, and then the biggest number I can have is -3. Looking back at my inequality, I have less than or equal to. So the equal to means I have to have a bracket with that -3. So kind of just to review, so infinity and negative infinity always get parentheses because they are concepts. They're not actual numbers. There is no end to the numbers, so there is no biggest number, there is no smallest number, which is why we have the use of infinity and negative infinity, just to say anything smaller or larger than this value works. The next thing we're going to take a look at is our compound inequality. So our inequality is using and or. So this first example is an example of and. -7 is less than x is less than or equal to 6. So you can break this up into two inequalities. You're saying x is greater than -7 and x has to be less than or equal to 6. I find these to be the easiest intervals to write because I know the smaller number is the number on my left, -7. My bigger number is the one on the right, which is 6. So the number on the left side goes on the left of my interval. The number on the right side goes on my right, smaller, larger. Now I just have to figure out parenthesis versus bracket. So this is where I split it up into two. So if I read that left side, it says x is greater than -7. So I have strictly greater, which means parenthesis with the -7. When I read it from the right side, I read it as x less than or equal to 6. So because I use that equal to, I have to use a bracket. Parentheses and brackets for something like this do not have to match. They can be different. Sometimes they might be the same, but they don't have to be. That last example we're going to look at is an example of a compound inequality for or. So we have x greater than or equal to 5 or x less than 1. Now just like when we're writing a single interval, we have to put the smaller number on the left, the larger number on the right. When we're writing two intervals like we do for or, we have to write the smaller interval first, then the larger one. So the interval that's going to contain our smaller values is always the inequality for less than. So in this case, that would be x less than 1. That inequality would be written as an interval containing our smaller numbers. So if I'm looking directly above, at that example to kind of help me. I know anytime I write a less than, I have to start with parenthesis, negative infinity, then comma, and then our value, which in this case is 1. Now I determine whether or not that 1 gets a parenthesis or a bracket. And because we're strictly less than 1, I'm going to put a parenthesis. Next, to represent that word or in mathematical notation, we use something called a union symbol. It's just basically a capital U. It is read or when you read intervals. Now I'm going to do my greater than inequality. So in this case, x greater than or equal to 5. So if I kind of use that first example as kind of my way to write my interval, I know I have to start with my number, which in this case is 5. Because we have greater than or equal to, I've said the word equal to, the 5 is going to get a bracket, and it's going to end with comma infinity, and then always a parenthesis with the infinity. So now I've got my smaller valued intervals on the left, my larger value intervals on the right, and I have my intervals that represent those inequalities. Next, we want to write the interval notation for a number line. So the way I always like to approach the number line intervals is I'll first write the inequality that is represented by the number line, then I use the inequality to write the interval. Now you don't have to. You can look directly at a number line and say, hey, this is the interval that represents that number line. That is perfectly okay. But in some cases, some people may need that extra step of first writing the inequality. So the first thing I look at is what type of circle we have and where that circle is. So if I'm looking, I have an open circle at 2. So when I write my inequality, I'm going to do x. Then I'm going to look to see which side of 2 have I shaded on. And because I've shaded the left side, I've shaded the values smaller than 2, I know that's going to be my less than, and then my number 2. So if I'm using the previous examples we've done that involved intervals for less than inequalities, I know I'm going to have parenthesis, negative infinity, comma, and then our number, which in this case is 2. And because I've used a strictly less than, I know I'm going to put a parenthesis. So again, you can go straight from this number line to this interval if you're comfortable enough, or you can take this first step of writing the inequality first. Our last example, we have the number line where I've got a closed circle at -1, and I've got an open circle at 3, and I've shaded between the two numbers. So that's a compound inequality, and it's going to be and. So it's going to look like that example we did above with the -7 less than x less than or equal to 6. I'm going to have my variable in the middle, and I'm going to have numbers on each side. So I start with the left side of my inequality, so my left number, in this case -1. So I've got a closed circle at -1, so I'm going to have an equal to. And if I were to ignore that the 3 is there, I've shaded everything to the right side, which is everything greater than or equal to -1. So I'm going to write my inequality backwards. I'm going to say x greater than or equal to -1. Now I look at the right number, which is 3. I have an open circle at 3, which means strictly less than or greater than. And if I were to ignore the -1, I've shaded everything to the left of 3, which is everything less than. So if I'm writing the right side, I'm going to say x is less than 3. So using that same example above with the -7 and the 6, when I write my interval, it's going to be -1 comma 3, since that's my smaller and my larger value. Reading that left side, we had x greater than or equal to, so I'm going to have a bracket at -1. And because we had x less than 3, I'm going to have a parenthesis with 3. Again, you can use the number line and go straight to writing the interval if you're comfortable, or we can take that first step of writing the inequality. As always, if you have any other questions over this, please reach out and let me know.